I just wanted to say a few words of welcome. This is the third in a series of 3 CPD sessions that we ran at the end of last year and into this year. The first one was around the really important topic of vocational philosophy, which Chris, who's chairing today, also works with us on. And that's developing really well. I know it's an area of interest for lots of colleagues around this table. We're going to have another series of debates in that space in the autumn. We've got a session coming up with colleagues from the ETF as a kind of internal development session in the summer, which we're really looking forward to running. Great that they were keen to do that. And also we've got a book in the works, which would be kind of bringing together some of the debates there and could then be used to help support initial teacher training in FE with that kind of element as well. So we're really excited about that development. On the history side, the history of FE and FE policy, we've been doing some exciting work within Edge on that learning from the past theme, publishing pieces of work looking back across the last kind of 30 years or so of policy making at specific policies and what we can learn from them. We've updated the carefully named honourable histories, not horrible histories. We don't want to infringe any copyrights, which looks back at the last 30-year kind of chronology. And we've also got a really exciting piece in the works with you at Keep and Lorna Unwin, which will look a bit further back at FE policy from 1900 through to 1992 and think about kind of what some of the longer term lessons might be. So when I finish talking, I'll pop some links in the chat to all of those in case you'd like to follow up. Which brings us on to the focus for today and current policy making. So I'm really excited to welcome some amazing colleagues and people I've had the lovely opportunity to work with over the years to this session, and we'll be bringing things kind of right up to the present day here. In terms of just a brief outline of what we're going to do, I'm going to hand over in a moment to Chris, who's going to chair the session and introduce our initial speakers. Each of the panel is going to give their perspective in this first half, and we'll have a bit of time at the end of this first half just to put a few questions to Beth and to Keith, who have to head off for some policy meetings in the second half, no doubt on this very topic. So we're really grateful for you sticking with us. We'll have a little break because I don't want anyone to get Zoom fatigue, and then we'll do some breakouts where we have a bit of a chance to digest what we've heard. And then we'll come back for a panel with the remaining panelists, and I'll join that as well so that Chris can quiz me on anything kind of policy related from my experience or from Edge. So that's the plan. We hope you really enjoy the session. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Chris, who is Professor of Educational Philosophy and Policy at King's College London, to chair the first part of this. Chris.
Thank you, Ollie. Just to say what my role will be in this part of the discussion, it's just to briefly introduce our speakers and then to keep time. And as Ollie intimated, those who have to leave early, we will give them a couple of questions to think about before they leave. So let's start with Keith Smith, who's Director of Strategy at the Department for Education. Keith, over to you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Ollie, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's well. We're in some quite strange times, so obviously thoughts are in lots of different places right now, as I guess many of you are, but it's great to actually spend some time now talking about what I think hopefully is our passion, our shared passion, and that is about how to really create a world-class skills system here across England. So just introduce myself again. I'm Keith. I'm Director of Post-16 Strategy in the department. For the last couple of years, I've been sort of putting together, I guess, the government's sort of skills strategy. And prior to that, I had the opportunity to work on apprenticeships as well as some other things. So I want to just talk a little bit about some personal reflection. I won't speak for long, because I know we've only got limited time, and I know actually the power of this event is to actually have a conversation and to actually share some reflections and to take some questions. So I'm going to try and make sure I leave plenty of time to do that. But I wanted to start from really reflecting that we're now over a year since we published the Skills for Jobs white paper. That year has absolutely flew by. It's amazing really to think how quickly you go from actually thinking about something to producing it, and we're actually a year into then now trying to sort of realise that. And I want to just probably share a few reflections, I think, on probably what still remains the same, where we're currently at, and then maybe just offer a few reflections on where we're probably at now and where things are potentially likely to be heading as we go forward. I wanted to start from just reiterating that it is our passion, but it's actually brilliant to see that the skills agenda overall is now really cutting across lots of different parts of government and government policy. And I think for all of us that are in the skills system, always should take a huge amount of confidence from that. Our reform agenda covers 2 of the PM's 6 top priorities, his personal priorities. I don't think we've ever really seen a time where there's been such amount of support and debate and interest in skills as a system. And so I think we have a massively, huge opportunity, I think, to capitalise on delivering some really great things. The case for change is still very much the same. We need a skills-based economy. We probably more than ever, because of the sort of domestic skills issues that are being sort of commented on pretty much daily now, actually have to have a skills system that can operate domestically, that can produce the sort of skills that employers need. Employers won't be necessarily accessing the labour market internationally in the same way as they were previously. So therefore, the focus on domestic skills becomes ever more acute. It's absolutely right that our aspirations through the skills reform agenda to produce some better focus or more of a focus on technical and higher technical training is also key. But I wanted to also underline, obviously, the importance of those critical core skills, particularly around maths and English, particularly maths, because we know actually strong maths actually makes such a huge difference in terms of people's future jobs prospects. So those things are all very much, I think, all absolutely true, and certainly remain now absolutely more true than ever. A couple of extra reflections, though, is that I think, since we talked about this a year ago, obviously government has now also published its Levelling Up white paper. And I think what the Levelling Up white paper, if you've had a chance to read that, actually sets out, the case for skills in the way that we've sort of, as I say, as way we've sort of, described it. But critically, it adds another dimension, which is, to make this really, work, it's got to be local, and it's got to actually operate, in every part of the country. And so the Levelling Up white paper, for us was a great opportunity to, to reintroduce, what our skills agenda, reform agenda was about. But actually critically to sort of build that into the government's plans and infrastructure for how to make sure that that is done locally. Now, our key flagship for this is things that we're putting through legislation right now, which is about creating a local architecture of local skills planning, so that we're creating a system that can actually respond locally to each local labour market. And we think that's really critical for the levelling up aspiration, so that not only are we creating a skills system that hopefully can be more responsive to employers and the jobs market, but actually it helps us to think about how to create a infrastructure in each part of the country. And we know that we have skills deficits in different parts of the country, and that's critical for us to actually lean into and make sure that we respond. So the Levelling Up white paper doesn't necessarily change our strategy. It actually reinforces it, but actually adds the extra dimension of making sure that it underlines the importance of place, and that we actually think about how to level up and how to actually introduce skills, in every part of the country, not just those that actually perform well at this point in time. I also wanted to, I guess, just reflect on that, the work that we're doing critically on, making sure this system can be understood and navigable by employers remains central. The system will not truly be a world-class system if people don't understand it and they don't know how to use it. So there's some ongoing really important work that we're doing, whether it be about the careers work that Sir John Holman's doing, whether it's be the work we're doing around system simplification and other things. It's the work we're doing around qualifications, reform. All these things are really important so that we can actually create a system that we have both confidence in, that we're actually investing in the right skills programs and the qualifications are of the right quality. But critically, I suppose the real strategic benefit and win for us is that we're trying to hopefully create that system. If it's going to be responsive to employers, if it's going to respond to local labour markets, then it's got to be understandable and it's got to be able to be used. And so that is a really key, I guess, continues to be a key challenge question for us in how do we really create that simple system, and how do we create the right incentives for all employers, including SMEs, to be able to engage into the system. That's going to be really quite important. Now, I should say at this point, that takes away nothing from the importance of careers and for learners making choices and decisions. That's absolutely central too. So those things taken together, I think, underline the same strategic point, that we've got to make sure that we kind of do more of that. And we've got to work hard, I think, collectively. That's our grand challenge. I want to just finally touch upon a couple of final points. There's one, again, that was we set out in the Levelling Up white paper, which was an extension of our skills reforms, which was the creation of the Future Skills Unit. Now, I wanted just to mention this because I think one of the things we feel is now really important in our sort of design of the system is the way that we use data. Now, one of the things I've talked a lot about this just now is the ability of learners and employers to be able to understand what the system is. We think actually we've got a huge opportunity to use data, to develop data products, to develop interfaces that enable people to be able to use that in a much more strategic way than we do currently. Now, you'll know that obviously for many years there's been a push on big data, which is about how does government get out raw data, how does it get out data for people to be able to use. And so what we're trying to do through the Unit for Future Skills is that we want to be able to be much more open about sharing across the system the data on things like participation, achievement and destination. We want to invest in new skills products that will just put data out for organisations to use that in any way they want. We hope, and our vision here is that organisations will use this data to develop new applications, new software, new interfaces to be able to people be able to interrogate all of that, and we think that's a really important thing. But we also, and again, this is the other, I guess, the point I wanted to leave you with, is we also need to try to think about how can we look forward rather than looking back. So we know a lot of our data talks about what people are doing right now. As a country, we've got to get really good at being able to understand skills supply issues and questions in a much better way than what we do at the moment. So the Unit for Future Skills is going to be set up to try to tackle those questions and try to lean in on those things because they really matter. And I guess, and finally, I just wanted to just finish upon, I guess, my final reflection, which is, it's really important that we also recognise that, we've got to continue to work really hard to ensure that we've got a system that can actually deliver this together. And I just wanted to pay tribute to the teaching profession within the sector. They do an amazing job. We know, however, it's really difficult, to recruit some lecturers and FE teachers at the moment. We know that we've got to work really hard to help professionalise, support their development. And again, I'm sure Dave will talk a little bit more about this in his session, but I wanted just to not finish my introduction just by sort of mentioning that actually this is all great, that we're creating new qualifications, a new architecture. We're hopefully going to have new data insights. We're going to hopefully have an ability to create the right incentives for organisations to plan and respond locally. That can only happen if we've got a world-class teaching workforce. And that's going to have to continue to be one of our central priorities. Whether it be about apprenticeships, T-levels, it doesn't matter. We need to recognise that and support that profession. We owe them so much in the work that they've been doing for students across the recent last 2 years because of COVID and the disruption. So that will finish my introduction, Chris, and pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Keith, for such a concise and panoramic overview of all the activity that's going across government. Very grateful to you. And of course, I think everyone will endorse your concluding remarks about the teaching profession in the sector. I'll go over now to Beth Chowdhury, who's Strategy Director at the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education.
Hi, it's really lovely to meet everyone today. It's good to follow Keith as well, because I want to explain how the Institute fits into the system, but a lot of the themes that Keith talked about in terms of better data, better understanding of local conditions in setting the national framework, and the importance of understanding employer views and quality of teaching are all things that, you know, we're very much all working towards all the same goals, which is really encouraging. I think my focus today is going to be on quality, the place of the Institute for Apprenticeships and Technical Education, which has existed for nearly 5 years, but the technical education is an expansion, and our remit is expanding further through the Skills Bill, which, you know, is going through Parliament at the moment. For us, the real watchword of our purpose is around ensuring quality in the system through ensuring that employers' needs are heard and understood. And that is both quality at a kind of system level, which I think chimes with some of Keith's points about, can people understand the offer available? You know, can they access the right skills opportunities and the right progression opportunities once they're in jobs? And then it's also quality at the individual level. So the primary purpose of the Institute is to work with employers to support them to set standards across 15 routes within the economy, and very much make sure that when whatever level someone's working at, whether it's through an apprenticeship or through a qualification, that when they come out of that, they are ready to, you know, hit the ground running in whatever skilled job that they are going into. And that employers are, we have a board of employers at the Institute. Employers are at our heart, but so are learners, of course, and very core to our mandate. So we have thousands of employers that we work with to set standards, but we also have panels of learners to test our products and seek feedback, and use learners to help us to work out where to prioritise reform next. So I just wanted to run through our 3 strategic priorities. We have a new chair at the Institute for Apprenticeships, Baroness Ruby McGregor Smith. You know, she's the chief executive of Mighty Group, so she's a representative of a really big employer, but she's also a person who came up through an apprenticeship route into accountancy herself, and then progressed on, and a big advocate for diversity in intake. And so so she is really kind of putting some oomph behind the strategic plan that we published a few months back. And that we have 3 key priorities. And the first is very much about delivering for employers, because in order to deliver what the labour market needs, we need to listen to employers and make sure that the products that the government is endorsing and approving are exactly what is needed. And we're looking at long-term assurance for qualifications now, as well as the quality standards that we've already matured to a degree on apprenticeships, to really make sure that employers understand and are aware of and trust people coming out of FE having done a qualification, as opposed to someone who's done a bit of on-the-job training and a bit of off-the-job training through an apprenticeship. And, you know, that's the new bit, how to really assure the quality and the pathways from full-time learning straight into skilled jobs. And we will welcome, you know, all feedback and support and collaboration in that kind of system-wide challenge that we're taking on. The second of our 3 strategic priorities that I just wanted to mention is continuous improvement. So that is very much about really listening and really making sure that we are learning from the employers that we speak to, through the route panels who support us to set standards, and through the trailblazers who bring forward new and revised ideas for standards, but also all of the other employers, training providers, awarding bodies, and learners that we're talking to all the time. And so at the Institute, we're putting more of a focus now on insight and intelligence, and how to really make sure we're gathering and making sense of what we're hearing, and then cycling that back into what we're doing, and working very much jointly with, as Keith mentioned, the Unit for Future Skills and colleagues in the Department for Education, to combine all of that power and foresight, but importantly for us at the delivery end of the spectrum, to make sure that that is taken into account then in the pace and the nature of the standards that we are developing and the qualifications that we are developing. The final of our 3 objectives is, in my view, the biggest and the kind of culmination point, and that is to build a more integrated skills system. So the system, and Keith talked about this already, the system is complicated, it is really difficult to access for some organisations and people, learners, especially small and medium-sized businesses. And they sometimes lack confidence in the quality of provision. And so we're very much, you know, taking the kind of inspiration from Lord Sainsbury's setup and framework of the 15 occupational routes to make sure that the knowledge, and I've seen there's a question on knowledge that we'll come back to, but the knowledge, the skills and the behaviours that employers say they need are understood and built in a consistent and flexible and agile way within the system. And our primary policy sort of innovation in that space at the moment is occupational maps. We're trying to develop those using scrape data from job adverts and all of those other types of insight that I've already mentioned to make sure that where there are cross-cutting knowledge, skills and behaviours, and an employer is looking at the occupational map to decide, okay, so what qualification or apprenticeship do I need to fill this gap that I've got in my skills base, that they can see different trajectories that people can take to come into that role and where careers might progress beyond that role, taking into account skills and knowledge and behaviours that are very specific to that standard and to that level, but also those that are cross-cutting. And we're really excited about the development of an occupational map that is more responsive and more able to build in, you know, near-term data to give users the best, clearest advice on mapping out careers. In terms of building an integrated system and simplification and language, occupational maps are a chance for us to look from first principles, you know, to listen to how employers are describing the skills that they need and make sure that we are, you know, echoing that and working with the lexicon and the building blocks that are understood in the market, and keeping that as simple as possible. And for us, that's a really big part of equity, diversity and inclusion, and opportunity for a much wider cohort of people to enter it, you know, talent to enter jobs and to rise up through jobs. And that's partly about levelling up, and it's partly about regional opportunities, and it's also partly about those, you know, if we look at our data on equity, diversity and inclusion, at the surface level, we've got pretty even gender splits of people taking up technical qualifications and apprenticeships. We've got a representative amount of Black, Asian and minority ethnic people entering skilled technical jobs through qualifications. But when you break that down by route, we've got a lot of progress to make. There are traditional occupations that still heavily favour particular gender groups and particular ethnic groups, and that's something that simplifying and improving access to the system and enabling more employers, including those smaller ones who don't have HR departments to support them, that's enabling all of that. I'm just getting a 2-minute warning. That's enabling all of them to access the system, and so that's very much a key part of how we want to improve the stature of technical education and allow more people to enter into the system and to progress once they're in there. So just to wrap up, it's great to be here. I'm really looking forward to talking to you, to hearing your views. And what I really want to know is how we can best work with you, how we can make the most of your insights, of your networks, views and experiences to deliver on this collective ambition for high quality technical education that Keith has, talked about, and so have I. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Beth, for giving us a sense of the scale and ambition of the work of your department. We're very grateful to you for that. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points. It's now my pleasure to introduce David Russell, who's CEO of the Education and Training Foundation. Over to you, David.
Thank you, Chris. well, it's fascinating to hear those introductions, and it allows me to take a slightly different position from my normal one. So the ETF as the professional body for the FE sector, but largely government funded, we're equidistant really between government and the sector, but well integrated with both. And quite often my role with sector colleagues is explaining government policy and indeed advocating for it. There's no point in me doing that today because you can hear it from the primary author of the white paper, Keith, and two very influential people in the system, and from Treasury and IFA. So I think it's my role to do something a bit different, Chris, and perhaps offer more of a critical critique over the next 6 minutes or so. So I'm sure DFE colleagues will forgive me if I do that. Keith started off by reminding us just how strong skills is in the government narrative now, and I think is absolutely right. You know, it is inescapable, not just the Prime Minister, but also the Treasury, the Chancellor, and the Levelling Up White Paper. You know, it's skills in a way that I can't remember. It's very striking. But I think there's a bit of a conundrum there as well, maybe a dichotomy even, between the strength of the narrative and the really rather modest spending review settlement that further education system got. You know, it was better than we've had for a while, but really not on the same scale as the transformational rhetoric that the government is celebrating. And I think that's a really interesting question. You know, why is there that dichotomy? And I've heard a few explanations. I mean, typically there are three explanations to this. The first one is, well, the government would like to invest more, but they can't afford it. It's just not affordable. Be realistic. I don't think that really flies. I mean, if you look at the continuing investment in the NHS, if you look at the absolutely incredible amounts of money that were spent responding to the pandemic, not just on the public health side, but on furlough, I think it's clear that when something is politically important enough, the government finds the money. So I don't really buy the it's not affordable argument. The second explanation is, well, they don't really mean it. They're just saying this stuff about skills because it appeals to voters in the red wall and so on. And actually, they don't really mean what they say. I don't buy that at all either. My experience working in DFE for 16 years is politicians, perhaps contrary to public perception, are not cynical. Officials are certainly not cynical. They don't say things when they don't mean them. So I don't buy that argument either, that it's all just eyewash. I think the real explanation is actually a lot more uncomfortable for the FE sector. And Harry will tell us in a minute whether I'm right about this. I think the real explanation is that the Treasury doesn't actually believe that significant increased investment in the FE system will deliver the outcomes the Treasury is looking for. And why don't they think that? I think two reasons. One is they think the sector is not high enough quality, so it can't spend additional money well. And the other reason is that they think the sector has too much autonomy, so it won't spend additional money well. And if I'm right about that, then the white paper, Skills White Paper, I think plays a really clear role, because really it says two things in essence. It says we will intervene in the sector to improve quality, and we will intervene in the sector to reduce or constrain autonomy, or introduce incentives would be a kind of more positive way of putting it. So I tend to see the white paper is full of fantastic ideas, commitments, promises, challenges to the sector. But really, I think it's kind of one long letter to the Treasury in a way, and it's saying this is the way. These are the ways we, the DFE, will change the FE system to make it a more investable proposition. And I think the Treasury bought that to an extent. I think that's why we got the settlement increase that we did. A bit of a down payment on a good plan, but no more than that. But if you look where the additional money is, it's really all attached to specific things. It's institutes of technology, it's T-levels, adult skills guarantee, boot camps, LSIPs, all this kind of thing. So, and this is absolutely government's entitlement, right? It's their responsibility, in fact, to attach public funding to where they think policy outcomes should be. So I don't criticize any of that, but the fact is it leaves leaders in the sector with a real conundrum. And there are some very serious sector leaders on this call now. I've noticed a few names. And if you're a CEO or college CEO, principal, or indeed a governing body, I think you have a really big strategic choice to make right now, which is, do we align our organization with government investment, or do we make our own decision about what we think our mission, purpose, responsibility is to our local community and for our learners? Because the two things may not coincide. And I think that's a really tough choice for sector leaders. That's kind of by way of analysis. I've only got sort of a minute or two left, so I want to kind of move on to some suggestions as well. Could it be any different? I mean, isn't it always going to be like this? Isn't this always the dynamic? You know, government wants to change incentives, attaches investment to the things it wants to see happening, and so on. Well, I guess so, but there is a possible different way of approaching this. I think government tends to see the system as something that it sits outside. Although I was really actually pleased to hear Keith not using that language. He talked about government being part of the FE system. I really welcome that. I think that's great, as well as what he said about world-class teaching workforce. But I do think there's still often a bit of a sense of trying to improve the system from outside. Government sits outside, you've got your long-handled screwdrivers, you're trying to fix things, or change things, or replace parts. And I do believe that the government bodies are very much part of the FE system, and they should stop trying to improve it. And instead, they should create a self-improving system, because I think that's the way we'll get really sustained and sustainable transformation and outcomes. And this is a huge topic, but just in summary, if you imagine that the performance of the FE system is distributed in a normal distribution, the things you need to do to bring about improvement are different at different points in this curve. How do you bring up the bottom of the bell curve? Well, that's about tackling the worst performance. That's about compliance enforcement, and that is absolutely a role for government, and I think it should focus there. It has a responsibility to do that. How do you stretch the top end of the performance curve? That's through research and innovation. Government may have a role to play there, but it's not so dependent. It's more about supporting and seeding and facilitating. And for the big bulk in the middle, how do you bring about improvement? Well, there are two ways. You can keep tinkering with lots of different improvement initiatives, or you can create a self-improving system. And I think that is the way to go. I think that's where the really exciting potential is. And the best news of all, I don't actually think it's very expensive. I think the things you would do to create a self-improving system are not particularly expensive. There are things like, it's all about investing in the capacity and capability of the teaching workforce and those who lead them. It's about things like subject-specific pedagogy, education and training centres. It's about a what works network. It's about things like sabbaticals to industry, so that teachers are constantly refreshing their industrial experience and expertise. It's about things like the government is doing on recruitment. Absolutely fantastic, you know, to create a facility that will kind of let the sector refresh itself and recreate itself in terms of its, you know, its workforce. Things like the Technical Teaching Fellowship that we run with the 1851 Commission, that are all about getting rich professional exchange, spreading excellence in technical teaching and vocational excellence. These are the things that I think will sustain quality in the system, and just spending far more time talking about curriculum content and talking about quality of technical and vocational teaching and learning. These are the things that will bring about sustained improvement. These are the things that will transform the outcomes in terms of employability, skills for productivity, and UK PLC. And I think that's very exciting. I think the white paper does have a big push in that direction, especially in chapter 5. But I think there's so much more that we could do as well.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for closely argued, trenchant, and ultimately positive contribution. And I'd like to now move on to our next contributor, who is Harry Leach, Head of Skills at HM Treasury. Over to you, Harry.
Thanks, Chris, and Ollie. You've timed the agenda very well. Hi everyone. I'm Harry. I'm Head of Skills at Treasury, so that basically covers everything post 16 in the landscape. So 16 to 19, adult skills apprenticeships and HE. I'm going to talk a bit about the role of Treasury in policy making and reflect on the last 2 years. I'll try and address some of David's points throughout that, but probably won't catch them all, but we can come back to them in the discussion. In terms of kind of Treasury's role in policy making, the first thing I'd say here is that the Treasury's got a dual role. It's sort of two departments in one. It's both a finance ministry and an economics ministry. We tend to think of it as a finance ministry, as the people who say yes and no to the cash. But we're slightly unusual in that the decision making for your kind of major economics ministry is in the same place. For us and for skills, there's some tensions there, but ultimately I think it's a really good thing. You're not simply looking at some of the points on affordability overall that David raised in terms of public finances, but our advice to the Chancellor is always about the economic benefits of particular investments. And the role, when we think about skills and skills policy, the focus is sort of far more on what does this mean for the bigger picture questions on productivity and productivity growth. To what extent is skills contributing to that, and what can we do to improve that? The Chancellor talked about it a couple of weeks ago as one of his sort of 3 major areas to focus on in terms of what we can do on productivity growth. The second thing I'd say, and as a consequence of that, and I hope Keith would agree, I think that means, whereas in other places in Whitehall there can be a lot of tension and friction between the Treasury and the Spending Ministry and departments, we've got much more of a collaborative relationship on the policy side. So the white paper is a great example of that, where it's not just an example of what David described as kind of DFE trying to convince the Treasury of the need for more money, but there's a real sense that we both have shared outcomes. We care about the same goals in the system, in particular the points Keith made on the kind of making the system intelligible and understandable for employers. I'd say our focus there on the policy side is not just about the spending, whether a particular investment is valuable or not, but it's far more about the outcomes, like to what extent can we show that investment here or these particular programs will get people into these good, highly skilled jobs that we talk about. In terms of the kind of the formal spending side, I would say a couple of points. Firstly, David makes a completely fair point about the kind of the issue of sort of proving the value for money, and he makes a really good point on where the money went in SR was on sort of quite particular programs and areas. I'd say that's a mix of 2 things. So firstly, it's areas where we have got really good quantifiable evidence that these programs are working, are leading to the right outcomes, be that kind of employment outcomes or sort of broader benefits. Or secondly, the sort of the alternate way that we'd be able to argue it is where we are kind of huge international outliers. So if you look at competitor nations, we have particular issues on technical skills, on sort of 16 to 19 funding, and on basic skills, and in particular mass, as Keith said on that. Make internally, that's how we're able to kind of prove the case. There's it's really difficult with some skills programs and investments, especially a kind of broad overall investment in the sector. It's really difficult, particularly in a context where government is, let's face it, in the business of rationing, and your choices is about investment in skills or a particular program versus investment in the NHS or another prisons, another area of public spending. We do need to be able to kind of get quite we need to really be able to prove that argument, be confident about the value for money of the investment. And I do think, I think David's right that the DSR settlement, which overall was a good settlement, but is invested in specific programs where we're confident on that, does reflect that. I would link that back to Keith's data point on the future skills unit. The better data we get, the better evaluation we get in the sector, the easier it is for me to play my role internally and advocate for that investment. So yeah, I think he's absolutely right to pull that out as a really important focus. Last thing I'd say just to reflect a little bit on the last 2 years of policy making for us, where obviously we've been driven by events. I'd say the focus for the Chancellor has very much been in two phases. So firstly, from March 2020, the outbreak of the pandemic, the focus there for us was, as the Treasury, was very much about the immediate response to COVID. At that time, we were incredibly worried about the unemployment forecasts, which were really dramatic at the time. The Chancellor was looking at kind of every lever that he could possibly pull to keep people in work, furlough scheme, or get them into or back into work. So that determined what we were thinking about in terms of skills policy. And I'd say that focus came out in the kind of investments at the time and in the plan for jobs. I think the questions we were thinking about is, firstly, who are we most worried about in this immediate context? Who are the cohorts we really need to worry about? Which at the time was your kind of young, under 25, low skilled, level 2 and below cohorts. What programs can be expanded quickly? Let's not get into the business of inventing too many new things. And what does the evidence suggest is most helpful to get that cohort back into work? So very much on the sort of immediate and quite binary unemployment versus employment. I'd say sort of post that, with the white paper and the spending review, and kind of now there's far more of a broader focus on the sort of more kind of long-term points. What's that Keith was making? What's our vision for the sector? How does that fit into the government sort of overall strategy on productivity growth? And the areas where certainly the Chancellor is much more interested in is those kind of more long-term questions about how employers interact with the system in particular, given his focus. Final point I'd make is this isn't just about public spending. So we spend annually around 10 billion on post-16 skills, not including higher education. Employers spend around 40 billion a year on training. Actually, quite not much of that goes to kind of formal training providers. A lot of it is far more informal or in-house. There's obviously a great prize in terms of productivity of being able to influence that spend, being able to know that we're spending it on high quality programs that lead to the right outcomes, and that's something the Chancellor's particularly interested in right now. What can we do on that broader question of employer spend that sort of goes beyond public spending?
Thank you so much, Harry, for giving us a really valuable insight into the way in which the Treasury approaches these questions and your interactions with other departments. That's really useful. I'm now going to turn to Terry Dillon, who's Senior Programme Manager at Skills Development Scotland. Terry.
Hi, well, thank you for having me here today. probably is the kind of sole representative of kind of the Scottish skills system. Is probably just kind of to take a wee bit further back than kind of perhaps some of the other presenters, just to kind of bring you up to speed. But probably kind of listening to kind of to Keith and Beth and others, there is obviously significant similarities, probably where the differences lie are in configuration and approach within Scotland. But we'll kind of start back a wee while, and I'll kind of hopefully kind of bring you up to speed and make it hopefully kind of give you the perception of coherence. Around about kind of 2015 was the kind of first kind of piece of most recent kind of apprenticeship policy or kind of skills policy within Scotland, and that was the kind of Wood Report. That looked at kind of how we engage more young people within vocational education, within training, and bridge that initial gap between education and industry. And that led to the introduction of kind of foundation apprenticeships, which are our Scottish-based kind of school apprenticeship or kind of vocational education offer. And through that led to the creation of school college partnerships and the introduction of vocational education within the kind of senior phase curriculum within the Scottish schools. As we moved forward a couple of years, we began to kind of look at the kind of introduction of kind of the learner journey review. And that was particularly focused on kind of how we kind of avoid repetition and kind of levels of learning. And at the same time of that, we began to kind of introduce a graduate apprenticeship offer similar to the degree apprenticeship model in England, which complemented the modern apprenticeship that we had at the kind of middle levels. Within that, that also established a strategic board looking at the kind of skills and education agencies across Scotland in a single board, and of a skills alignment unit. So those that fund vocational education and those that fund education are working together to look at kind of common areas of development and where funds should be most appropriately spent. And with these two new products, our foundation apprenticeship within schools and our graduate apprenticeships reaching into the kind of university space, we looked at the kind of within 2019 the development of future standards architecture strategy. And that's to kind of about some of the areas that kind of Beth talked about around kind of building those pathways, so that if you have someone that goes through a kind of vocational education program within the schools, you can see where the next step from that is, but using apprenticeships not as a single instance of learning, but perhaps as a kind of progressive model of learning throughout their career that individuals could step on and step off of that roadmap. And through that, and working with our Scottish Apprenticeship Advisory Board, similar to kind of probably the IFATE board around about employer-led, employer staff, begin to kind of think about how we implemented a new approach to apprenticeship development. And that was very much in terms of kind of some of the areas you spoke about around about kind of making sure that actually that we're engaging directly with employers, not through sector skills councils as been previously done, engaging with individuals and employees to make sure that actually there is a direct line of reference between the work that's been done and the skills that are required for that work and actually what's reflected within two apprenticeships. But that's not overlooking some of the other pieces around about the future skills that Keith and others spoke about. So beginning to kind of think about how we can take a system-wide approach to engage innovation agencies or catapults in the development of apprenticeships so that we can understand actually what should be included within apprenticeships and what perhaps is required within the skill system, but is perhaps just kind of slightly beyond kind of what looks into that role at the moment. But if we can bring that kind of up to speed, then very recently within Scotland, we have had the release of the National Strategy for Economic Transformation. And that has kind of 5 key themes within it, all of which kind of speak in and kind of reach into the skills agenda. Looking at kind of one of those the first of those key themes is looking at kind of entrepreneurial people and culture. So beginning to kind of think about how we can create apprenticeships and create vocational education offers that are perhaps, number one, more useful and accessible to small to medium enterprises and startups, how they can use those to kind of begin to kind of reach into that space. But additionally, beginning to think about kind of how we can support entrepreneurship within individuals. And part of that's kind of playing into the recommendations that we received from the OECD recently in the Strengthening Skills from Scotland report, beginning to explore elements of kind of master craftsperson qualifications that gives individuals the skills to be more entrepreneurship and to support progression within that. But also then beginning, the second theme is looking at things like new market opportunities. So beginning to kind of understand kind of what are the supporting technologies that play in, how can we create apprenticeships and create jobs and roles that support things like net zero or carbon transition. but also get into the space of where we can identify areas of kind of high growth or kind of that support inward investment within Scotland, within the skills system. And to that end, beginning really to look at things like data science, DevOps, digital manufacturing, and how we create apprenticeships with component parts that can then be used to kind of structure it and think about that as a kind of support more modular and hybrid roles as they begin to emerge, or our jobs begin to, or occupations begin to kind of blend with each other. But also the third theme within that is looking at kind of productive businesses and regions, and this kind of plays into kind of what Keith mentioned about kind of local skills planning. How do we engage with the kind of regions of Scotland to understand what it is they need, and also engage with the institutions in these areas, whether it's in the Highlands or the borders of Scotland, perhaps kind of some of the more rural areas, to engage with and make sure that they have not only the national provision, but the local partnerships to support that provision and to support the areas. And kind of moving into the kind of last one around about kind of a fairer and more equal society. And this is kind of building on the back of the Scottish Government's Fair Work Convention or Fair Work Commission, and looking at how we ensure that the apprenticeships that we build are for good jobs, that engage people within it, and through the design of apprenticeships are really beginning to think about kind of how we create quality work and quality opportunities for individuals within that. So probably, I don't know how long that was, but probably that's something from me just now. I think probably as we move forward with kind of the skills policy, I think one of the key areas that we are beginning to look at, and in terms of thinking about how we develop apprenticeships, is very much in the kind of the modularization and how we can then begin to kind of think about, as roles and as employer needs begin to kind of get more diverse in terms of the roles that they're actually looking for their company, begin to think about how we take, and as we build apprenticeships, understand the competencies, capabilities, and standards within these, and how these can potentially be disaggregated into different approaches to support different employers with their different skills needs, but are very clearly articulating that this is a standard of competence within a particular area. So beginning to think about how we can deliver more in a more agile way, not only in terms of the content, but using things like digitally enabled learning and the delivery of apprenticeship to begin to kind of make sure that actually we're providing the right skills and they're available to anyone, regardless of the geography within Scotland.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry, for the insights into the way in which VET policy is developing in Scotland. We're very grateful to you. We are a bit on a tight schedule, and we know that Keith has to leave soon. So I've taken the liberty of firing a question at Keith so that he's ready primed before he leaves. And my question to Keith was about the extent to which the DFE is able to coordinate across other departments to ensure that they are supporting your initiatives. For example, how can transport links between workers and young people on the one hand and workplaces and colleges on the other be provided to optimize the provision of opportunities in the locality? So Keith, before you go, if you wouldn't mind addressing that one, we'd be very grateful.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And apologies, everyone, I've got to rush. As I said at the beginning, I've got some urgent business I need to attend to. So it's a great question, Chris. And just a couple of things I think I'd say on this is that I mentioned at the very beginning of my presentation that obviously this is a prime ministerial priority. We've got architecture across government led through number 10, through the PM himself. We have a sort of what we call a skills implementation arrangement. This report's directly into number 10. We've not had that previously, and I think that gives you some sense of the exposure, the attention that's being placed here. And so we do a huge amount of work between the secretaries of states, between the different departments, in giving status updates, performance updates. It's the place where actually we get a lot of reporting on where DWP are coming from, where we're coming from, and it actually acts as a really great place for high-level policy to be discussed. And it's also just a signal, I think, of Harry's point that this is a real collaboration across government. You know, there is no sense here this is being done to. This is about us creating an architecture. So that's one really important point. The second point I'd say is the Unit for Future Skills will not just be a DFE unit. It will be housed in the DFE, but it will actually be cross-government. So we've actually got some work going on at the moment to do some work across all government departments about how we'll be using and maximising their data and their inputs into the sort of the endeavour that I sort of mentioned before. And then finally, I'd say the levelling up white paper. There was a huge amount of sort of cross-government working, which is now sort of being developed into sort of an implementation phase. So those are the three sort of top examples that come to mind. But I think the final thought I'd leave you with in answer to your question, Chris, is these do feel like very different times in the way that we're trying to create a real common endeavour for skills. There is a shared agenda, and actually I would probably finish on one of the real advantages of having a government white paper is that this is not just DFE strategy, this is government strategy. So there's a huge amount of work, not just in technical terms of sort of like write rounds and things like that, but there's a huge amount of engagement and policy endorsement that's happening. We've got more to come. The job is not done. We know we've got a huge amount still to do, particularly DWP, in joining up some of the services there. We're doing a huge amount with the Ministry of Justice on bringing apprenticeships into prisons and how we support post release and how we sort of support transition into the community. We're doing huge amounts with BAYS on sectors. Much of our boot camp design came out of actually discussions with BAYS on how to sort of tilt into certain sort of occupations in certain parts of the country. So there's some really good examples that are now coming, but I would say there's a huge amount of commitment there, but I do recognise there's still more to do. And on that note, Chris, I must send apologies because I must dash, but I hope that's answered your question.
Thank you very much for a very full answer and for all your contribution, Keith. It's great to see you.
Thank you, and take care, everybody, and thanks so much for your support.
Beth, I understand that you're on a fairly tight schedule as well, so I wonder if I might take the liberty of posing a question to you as well. And what I wanted to go back to was your point about that your concerns were not just about employers, although they're clearly very important, but also about learners as well and the interests of learners. And one thing that interested me was the extent to which you want to make qualifications sufficiently broad to create perhaps something like a nascent occupational labour market so that learners who've acquired a qualification will be able to travel across the country to use their skills and their qualifications will be recognised across a fairly wide spectrum of employers. Have you any thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Interesting question. I mean, I guess, well, to start with the kind of cross the country point that you make at the end, while the levelling up agenda and white paper call on us all rightly to have much more sensitivity to the fact that the regions of England are different. And as Terry talks about, we can learn a lot from the devolved administrations, how they run their nations and also their regional approach. So I think I think maintaining national standards that are recognised across the country is really important for quality, and we don't want to go back to these disaggregated days where different bits of England have slightly different ways in. I think there's something about recognition of what qualifications are, and I'm actually a relative newcomer to this sector. Most of my career in the civil service has been in climate and energy, and so just to sort of speak a bit personally rather than for the institute, but looking into this system, there have been different qualification products with different names over that have changed quite a lot and seem to be quite opaque sometimes to understand, and it's therefore perhaps not surprising that when you do this amazing sort of scraping of job ads across millions of adverts, which we've now got the data and sort of technology to be able to do, you find that jobs almost never ask for a technical qualification as a passport to say, I have got the skills to start working for you. And so I think there's, in terms of the simplification of the system, there's something about getting recognition for how, you know, for the quality and labeling and does what it says on the tin nature of qualifications, and then really listening to some of the points that people have made in the chat about stability. You know, it's going to take time for I think T levels are brilliant, and we're working through them, and we're evaluating as we go along and as we roll them out, and we're improving details about them. But sticking with that program, and the Secretary of State wears his T-level badge in every single interview I've seen him in the last 6 months. So that's really positive. But kind of sticking with it, keeping on evaluating, making them better, but under that kind of brand, so that that does get more recognition from schools through to employers and everybody in between. You know, because I think there is a kind of recognition problem as well as a quality problem, and these are both things that we're working on. Does that answer your question, Chris?
It does. Thank you very much. That's really helpful. Ollie, I'm aware we've got timekeeping to attend to. What's your advice now about taking a break?
We have. Thank you so much for that first half. It was absolutely great. So yes, we know that we don't want to give everyone Zoom fatigue. So let's take 5 minutes now. Great. We hope you really enjoyed those conversations and the chance to talk in a slightly smaller environment, closer environment. Do feel free to use the chat, share kind of any key reflections you'd like, or any questions that you might like Chris to pick up in this final part. And Chris, I'd like to welcome you back to take the chair for this final panel bit of the session.
Thank you very much indeed, Ollie. I guess one of the things we could do is to take up some of the points that have been made in the breakout rooms, and the collators of comments in the breakout rooms are very welcome to pass them on to me via chat, and I'll try and bundle them up for our panel. In terms, I'll take the liberty here of just reporting on some of the discussions in our panel, and one of the issues raised is really quite a macro question for policymakers, I guess. It started off with some comments about the profusion of qualifications and institutions, and it moved on then to talking about the market logic, which, if you like, underlies this profusion, and then raised the question, to what extent have we got the balance right between running a market-based system on the one hand and a more coordinated system on the other? I think this is one of the big difficult questions for VET policy, which obviously covers a huge range of areas, but I'd be very interested in the responses of our panel to that. I don't know, Ollie, would you like to start off?
Thank you, Chris. I'd love to. So yeah, I think one of the kind of ongoing phrases that sticks in the mind about the English system is the idea of employers being in the driving seat. And we've kind of joked in the team that the driving seat can sometimes get a bit kind of crowded, because sometimes government documents talk about young people or apprentices being in the driving seat. It's an area where a lot of people have a kind of a strong influence. And I think that kind of emphasis on employers having a really key role has been very important to the system. But it's also led to some challenges. And Beth mentioned in her piece earlier the creation of the occupational maps that IFATE are working on. And in a way, I think that's trying to regain a bit of the kind of the structure, the supporting structure that's been partly lost with the removal of things like national occupational standards in England, which of course are still a really important part of Terry's work and the colleagues who are working in the devolved administrations. But what I think it's led to is sometimes some of the hard conversations not always being had with employers and pushing back. And I remember from my own time working on apprenticeships that, just to give one example, there were two very closely aligned to a layperson kind of sectors and groups who both wanted an apprenticeship standard. And the feeling was, really it should be perhaps one standard, but because they were both quite powerful and strong kind of sectors in their own rights, they ended up with two parallel standards that were very similar. And I think we've seen potentially a challenge there with some of the proliferation of standards and also some of the narrowness. You at Keep loves to kind of share examples of very narrow and specific standards, his favorites being mineral weighbridge operator and dual fuel smart meter installer, and those always stick in my head, compared to perhaps some of the work that's been done by, for instance, colleagues in Scotland to embed, meta skills that we saw in our recent research into graduate apprenticeships. So I guess I'm saying all things in moderation. Employers have an absolutely key role, but I think we do need to move slightly back towards some underpinning, some planning, some occupational maps to help to kind of structure the system. And it's great to hear that colleagues in IFA are starting to do that with the occupational mapping work.
Terry, Scotland has been mentioned in this connection quite a bit, and I wonder if you've got any comments to make from your perspective on the market's coordination duality. You're on mute. Right, I think Terry seems to be frozen.
Yeah,
as well.
Terry doesn't seem to be on mute on the system, but I think he might be struggling with his connection. So
right.
If you want to move on, Chris, I'll just drop him alone.
Yeah, by all means. Harry, would you like to comment on this issue?
Thanks, Chris. I think it's a really good question. I mean, there's a big question about the kind of the qualifications market here, but it also goes far broader. There's a big question about to what extent does FE operate as a market, and should we be pushing for more collaboration, which is probably more in keeping with the question on the white paper, the direction on the white paper. In terms of the qualification one, I'd say it's a really interesting one, where the kind of the push has always been for less qualifications for clarity's sake, but I'm just noting the conversation in the sidebar. We have an assistant puppet maker in apprenticeship, but is it a problem if no one's taken it? So I guess I'm interested in broader reflections on what exactly is the issue with the qualifications market. Is it complexity, confusion? Is it too many? Is that an issue for learners in itself? And is a solution to that the current direction of travel, or is it moving in a different direction?
Yeah, thanks, Harry. It's very interesting that whenever people do suggest chopping things or cutting things down, there's plenty of protests about it, and you can already see this in the case of the level 2 consultation. So there's a sense in which there's a very narrow space indeed where you can satisfy everyone. David, have you any comments to make on this markets versus greater coordination dichotomy in VET policy?
I'm really sorry, Chris. I had to take a phone call right then, so I missed the bulk of what was said there. So I worry about saying something that doesn't quite fit in. So pass over me for now.
Okay, right.
I think Terry is back, Chris, and back up and running.
Yep. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Terry.
Sorry, I was going to say that number one, probably the funding mechanism in Scotland lends itself to a more system-led or kind of planned approach, due to the fact that we don't have kind of the apprenticeships in Scotland aren't funded directly from kind of individual employers' levy pots, and that allows us the degree to kind of certainly be more system-led in terms of the approach that we're taking. So that allows us to kind of work with employers and say that the apprenticeships that we're developing are to benefit the system, not a single employer. So beginning to look at the consolidation of where we have multiple apprenticeships, such as we have apprenticeships in retail, customer service, and hospitality, which all at their core have strong elements of customer service provision, and to think about how we can create kind of more create apprenticeships with multiple layers in it that have a general layer where there are shared common skills that enable individuals to recognise where there are skills and competencies that they share with other occupations. And that, we believe, gives more flexibility both to the individual and to the employer, especially as we move into a role where I think I've seen something the other day to say something like 80% of the workforce in 10 years' time is already in the workforce. So it's probably going to need to move into a position of where we are saying it's about recognising the skills that we have and building upon them, rather than saying everybody's skills and the skills of kind of each individual occupation are entirely different. It's about saying how can we kind of recognise those. So that, I think certainly the funding mechanism itself for apprenticeships in Scotland lends itself to more system-led approach. And I think that's the kind of approach that we're taking. And to be honest, that there are employers that are looking for a far more targeted and far more job-specific apprenticeship. But what we are very keen in pushing back and saying, there are elements of which these roles which are specific to you as an employer, but they are out with the role of apprenticeships as we view them within Scotland. But we are looking very much at occupational competence, and that's got to be the functional competence of that individual rather than the systems they use, the processes they follow, which may be unique to one employer or a small group of employers.
Thank you, Terry. David, I wondered whether you'd like to comment on that point.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I mean, on the sort of broader topic of sort of what the market demands, as opposed to kind of what the integration that the system can provide. Yeah. So I think there's something really fundamental here about curriculum content that I just kind of briefly touched on earlier. There's no way that a vocational education system could possibly keep up with the changing demands of modern workplace. You know, it's just not possible to redesign curriculum, then design qualifications on the back of that, ensure standards, train the teachers with the new specifications, and follow that through into robust, valid assessment. By the time you've done all that, the needs of employers have moved on. I think this is a massive challenge to curriculum in vocational education and training. I think the solution to the conundrum is to think more clearly about the difference between education and training. And I think vocational education needs to focus on the underlying knowledge with explanatory power that changes very slowly or not at all. And that's what sets you up for work and life, but also for working in a particular sector. And then I think the changing needs of employers needs to be done on a very fast turnaround with a very light touch regulation. And that is the place where you should give employer leadership, and because they know exactly what they need in their workplace now and next month, and possibly, if you're lucky, next year. So I think a much clearer thinking about the difference between vocational education and vocational training is one of the things that's missing in our system and would hugely benefit us. I'm quite optimistic about T-levels because I think they do try to focus on the underlying core content that has explanatory power. I think they don't try to keep up with necessarily the sort of changing needs. Apprenticeships, I'm a lot less confident that they've really thought this through. I think there's a real mix of ones that are trying to do one, trying to do the other, and things that are trying to do both. And then finally, I would say, I understand why the system wants to create apprenticeship standards that prepare you for a particular job, because this is how apprenticeships always used to be. You're an apprentice goldsmith, you're an apprentice cabinet maker. This is not really how modern economy works. You can prepare for a broad kind of sector area, but specific job roles within that change very quickly. And we know that the vast majority of jobs are going to be heavily affected by mechanization, by AI and big data. Very few jobs are going to disappear completely. Very few new jobs are going to be completely created out of nothing. Almost all jobs are going to be affected very significantly by the effect of changing technology. So I think the old apprenticeship paradigm really has to be rethought quite a lot for it to be fit for a current economy.
Thank you, David. I think that raises a really important issue which we might want to pursue. Just to start it off, can the distinction that you've just made be encapsulated by the distinction between initial and continuing vocational education? And if the answer is yes to that, I'm not suggesting it necessarily is, does that mean that one can afford to have really quite broad initial vocational education qualifications? I wonder what other people think about that point. Perhaps Ollie, you'd like to come in again on this one.
That's a really fascinating question, Chris, and I loved what David was just saying. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of particularly younger people who are moving into this space would really benefit from a much broader outlook to start with. I know certainly I and a lot of the young people that we work with now don't know exactly what they want to do. They might have a really creative focus, but they might not yet want to know that they want to become, to use David's example, an apprentice goldsmith. So I think giving them that breadth at the start, but allowing them to explore different routes is really, really important, and is one of the really positive things about the way that T-levels are being thought of in terms of kind of part of a broader family or occupational area before narrowing down. I'd love to take that even further and see some of that blending back into the kind of school and general education that young people get, to give them kind of tasters of those kind of areas. Thinking about kind of learning from the past, the Young Apprenticeships program was an amazing kind of opportunity to do some of that, and I'd love to see kind of more of that happening. I also think that some of the terminology that we use here has become so broad that it risks losing its kind of spark. I mean, apprenticeships is one example. It's absolutely the case that we need a great program that prepares people for their first career. It's also the case that we need some great continuous training. Do they all need to be called the same thing, or do we need to have a bit of brand differentiation? Because we know from surveys that a lot of particularly older employed apprentices don't even know that they're on an apprenticeship and might kind of react negatively to that term. So yeah, a few more questions for the pot, Chris.
Harry, I'd like to bring you in at this point. What would be the perspective from your department on this issue that David raised?
I think it's an excellent question, and I agree with David's categorization. I'd say two things. I'd probably bring it a little bit broader. You know, really, this is beyond, and this.
Oh, Harry, I think your sound's cut out there for us. Treasury obviously haven't made their broadband
government policy, but modern training, we have a very narrow post-16 curriculum. Is that working now?
Yes, we lost a little bit of what you said, Harry.
Sorry, yeah, our Wi-Fi is pretty terrible. I was saying two things. So firstly, yeah, personal view, not position of the department. But 16 to 19, we have a very narrow curriculum comparatively, and arguably the same is true with HE as well. I mean, lots of other countries have a similar HE system, but there are lots where the curriculum is still far more broader, which sort of points back to David's thesis and the kind of argument for a slightly more generalist approach. I think the one big issue that we need to confront to move to more of a better definition between education and training is just a blunt question about participation, particularly for older cohorts on the training side. We know, there's sort of lots and multiple barriers to getting adults, particularly the ones who need it most, to re-engage with training. There's some positive steps that the government are taking there in terms of, well, if you look at something like boot camps, it's sort of shorter, sharper, and kind of gets around those barriers, but we certainly haven't addressed it all. And again, that's a comparative problem where we have sort of lower participation than, exactly as David's just said, than most OECD countries. Like there's a sort of cultural aspect that we'd need to do a lot to shift to make.
Thank you, Harry. I'd like to bring in Terry on this point, because I suspect the Scottish experience here might be slightly different from that of England. Terry.
Sorry, Chris. With regards to
the education training dichotomy and the contrast between providing broad qualifications, which have, as David put it, quite a strong educational element, and the need to respond to changing demands in the marketplace and in technology and so on.
Yeah, I think that kind of. I think that as we move into kind of different levels of apprenticeships, and I think that, I agree that kind of looking at, and one of the ones we're looking at most recently is kind of engineering, and where we have somewhere in the region of 6 or 7 different engineering apprenticeships, looking at kind of how we can consolidate those to understand, where there are common elements of skill and education and knowledge, within them. So I agree with kind of David's point that there's going to be underpinning knowledge and education that's required for kind of a number of different roles. The functions of kind of, as we look at the pathways within that engineering, whether that's chemical, electrical, mechanical engineering, obviously the functions of these roles, and to an extent kind of probably some of the skills within them are not only different between each other, but to David's point, will change far more rapidly than the education that underpins the function of it. So I certainly think that, you know, it's a really great point, and probably not one that we have been consciously exploring, but certainly kind of something that is certainly worth interrogating, because as we begin to kind of move on, especially looking at things, and picking up on a recent example where we looked at something like digital manufacturing, there is a piece of knowledge that sits on top of the kind of engineering piece in there, which says, well, actually, what's the knowledge that a standard engineering technician requires to work within that environment? The skills and the technologies are still emerging within that space, but we have a broad understanding of kind of what the education and what the knowledge looks like, but the skills and technologies that are going to be used are still emerging. So I think there is kind of, these things are certainly kind of worth viewing, if not necessarily in isolation, but viewing as two discrete things.
Thank you very much, Terry. That's really, really useful. I'm aware we're running out of time now, and Ollie is fairly keen to wrap up. But I just quite like to make a couple of observations about this round of the discussion. First of all, and this is as much a question as anything, is when you talk about education, David, do you just mean vocationally related education, or were you thinking in terms of a broader education offer, particularly for young people who are making the transition from school to VET? And the other point I wanted to make about breadth is that some years ago I had a look at the figures for occupational mobility in Germany, a country which is very much oriented towards occupation as a form of social identity. And quite surprisingly, you see quite a lot of not just job mobility, but occupational mobility as well. But when you look closer at that, the occupational mobility seems to very much be centered on cognate occupations. So for example, of the 17 occupations in construction, you can see people moving around quite a bit within those. And part of the clue to that is having a very broad base at the start of a 3-year apprenticeship, where the construction sector is the main object of study rather than specific occupation. And I just wonder, I don't know if we've got time now, Ollie, but I thought those were both two issues that might be worth following up at some point.
Very much so, Chris. Yeah, I think that's been an absolutely fantastic discussion. As ever, I want to have another 2 hours, but I think that might just kill us all. So I just wanted to say a huge thank you to Chris, as ever, for leading the debate so well, making sure everything is kind of simple and clear. And a massive thank you to the speakers who are all absolutely brilliant. We've recorded this, so we'll edit the video down. Obviously, we haven't recorded the breakout rooms, and we'll pop that online next week so that you can share it with colleagues. We'll also write up a couple of little articles, just kind of encouraging further debate. So we want to make this kind of another step forward in an ongoing discussion. So do stay in touch. Huge thanks to everyone, and we hope that you have a really good rest of your day.